I died on my wedding night. The man I'd loved for 3 years, the man I just married in front of 200 guests, poisoned my champagne during our first toast as husband and wife. But when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in heaven or hell. I was back in our hotel room, 3 hours before my death, with the taste of bitter almond still burning my throat. My name is Emma Carter, and I'm about to tell you how discovering my husband's 3 other wives saved my life and destroyed his perfect con. The clock on the nightstand read 9:47 p.m. In 3 hours and 13 minutes, I would die in this same bed, choking on my own blood while David held my hand and whispered false declarations of love. But this time I had knowledge he didn't expect. I knew exactly what kind of monster I'd married. I sat up carefully, testing my body for any sign that this was a dream. Everything felt real. The silk of my wedding dress against my skin, the weight of my grandmother's pearl necklace at my throat, the lingering taste of the dinner we'd shared downstairs. The French doors to our honeymoon suite balcony were open, letting in the warm Miami breeze and the distant sound of waves against the shore. David was in the bathroom, preparing what he'd told me was a special surprise for our first night as husband and wife. I knew now that his surprise was a champagne toast laced with enough cyanide to kill me within minutes. In my previous life I'd drunk it eagerly, thinking it was romantic that my new husband wanted to make our first moments as a married couple so special. I'd even complimented him on the slightly bitter taste, saying it must be an expensive vintage with complex notes. He'd smiled and said it was a family tradition, this particular champagne. His grandmother had served it at her wedding, his mother at hers. Now it was my turn to be part of the family. What he hadn't told me was that it was also the family tradition to murder your wife on your wedding night and collect her life insurance money. This time I had different plans. I stood up quietly and walked to the window, looking out at the ocean that had been the last thing I'd seen in my previous life. The Ritz-Carlton in Key Biscayne was David's choice for our honeymoon, remote enough that no one would hear me scream, luxurious enough that my death would be seen as a tragic accident rather than murder. A heart attack, the coroner had ruled in my previous timeline. Sudden cardiac arrest, possibly brought on by the excitement of the wedding day. These things happen sometimes to young women under extreme stress. David had played the devastated widower perfectly, weeping at my funeral, establishing a scholarship in my name, using my death to gain sympathy and social standing in our community. What none of the mourners knew was that I was the 4th Mrs. David Sterling, and that the 3 women who came before me had all died under mysterious circumstances. The bathroom door opened, and David emerged with a silver tray holding 2 crystal champagne flutes. He looked devastatingly handsome in his white dress shirt and black trousers, dark hair perfectly styled, brown eyes warm with what I'd once believed was love, but now recognized as predatory satisfaction. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice soft and intimate, "are you ready for our first toast as husband and wife?" Mrs. Sterling, the name that 3 other women had died carrying. I forced myself to smile and move away from the window. "I've been thinking about that name all day," I said, which was true in a way he couldn't imagine. "Mrs. Sterling. It sounds so permanent." His smile faltered slightly. Something in my tone must have seemed off to him, though he couldn't place what. "Permanent and perfect," he said, setting the tray on the small table by our bed. "Just like our love." I watched him carefully as he handed me one of the flutes. In my previous life I'd been so focused on his handsome face, so overwhelmed by the romance of the moment, that I hadn't noticed the subtle tells that should have warned me. The way his hand shook almost imperceptibly as he held the poisoned glass. The way his eyes didn't quite meet mine. The way he held his own glass lower, making sure there was no chance we might accidentally switch drinks. "To forever," he said, raising his champagne. "To forever," I repeated, but I didn't drink. David waited, his glass hovering halfway to his lips, watching me. When I didn't immediately take a sip, concern flickered across his features. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "I'm just savoring the moment," I said. "Our first toast as husband and wife. I want to remember everything about this night." "Of course, darling." He lowered his glass without drinking. "Take all the time you need." But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the calculation behind his eyes. He needed me to drink first. Whatever poison he'd used, it probably took effect quickly, and he couldn't risk drinking from the wrong glass by mistake. Actually, I said, setting my untouched champagne on the nightstand, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. Could you give me a moment? Maybe step onto the balcony while I collect myself. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, sweetheart. Wedding days can be emotionally intense. Take all the time you need. But he didn't move toward the balcony. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his champagne, watching me with eyes that were beginning to show irritation rather than love. You know, he said casually, my grandmother always said that wedding night champagne should be drunk immediately, while the bubbles are still perfect. Otherwise, it loses its magic. Your grandmother, I repeated. Tell me about her. What was her name? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Her name? Well, her name was Margaret. Margaret Sterling. I smiled. And what about your mother? You mentioned she also had this champagne at her wedding. Yes, my mother Elizabeth. Both wonderful women. Both very traditional about wedding customs. I nodded as if this information was perfectly reasonable, though my heart was racing. In my previous life, David had told me his grandmother's name was Catherine and his mother was Susan. The fact that he couldn't keep his lies straight suggested he'd told this story to multiple women, probably mixing up details between wives. I'd love to hear more about your family traditions, I said. But first, let me just freshen up. I walked toward the bathroom, moving slowly so he wouldn't think I was trying to escape. Behind me, I heard him set his champagne glass down with more force than necessary. Emma, he called, and something in his voice made my skin crawl. Come back here. We really should have our toast now. I turned around, keeping my expression innocent. Of course, darling. I just need a moment. But instead of going into the bathroom, I moved toward the hotel room door. Actually, you know what? I think I left my lipstick in the car. Let me just run down and get it. No. The word came out sharper than he'd intended. He caught himself and softened his tone. No, sweetheart, you don't need lipstick. You look perfect. Come back here and let's have our champagne. There it was, the mask slipping. The charming facade cracking to reveal the predator underneath. David, I said carefully. Is there something in that champagne? His face went completely still. For a moment we stared at each other across the hotel room, and I could see him calculating his options. He could continue the charade, try to convince me I was being paranoid. He could attempt to force me to drink. Or he could drop the act entirely. He chose option 3. You're smarter than the others, he said. His voice completely different now. Cold, analytical, devoid of the warmth that had fooled me for 3 years. I wondered if you might be the others. He smiled, but it was nothing like the loving expressions he'd worn throughout our courtship and wedding. This smile was predatory satisfied. My previous wives, of course. Catherine lasted about 2 minutes after the toast. Susan took almost 5, she had a stronger constitution. And poor Rebecca. Well, Rebecca figured it out just like you did, but unfortunately for her, she wasn't quick enough to avoid drinking. Catherine, Susan, Rebecca. 3 names I'd never heard him mention. 3 women whose lives he'd stolen just as he'd planned to steal mine. How many? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. You would have been number 4. Though honestly, I'm not sure I would have stopped there. It's become something of a hobby. He picked up his champagne glass and took a casual sip. The insurance money is nice, of course, but there's something addictive about the whole process. The courtship, the wedding planning, the moment of realization in their eyes. It's quite thrilling. I felt sick, not just from fear but from the knowledge that I'd shared a bed with this monster for months, had loved him, had trusted him with my body and my heart. Why? I whispered. Why not? He shrugged. I'm good at it. I'm charming, successful, attractive. Women trust me easily. And they all have life insurance policies that make the investment worthwhile. Your policy alone is worth $1.2 million. $1.2 million. The policy I'd taken out at his suggestion, naming him as the sole beneficiary. He'd convinced me it was romantic, a way of showing our commitment to each other. The wedding was expensive, he continued conversationally, as if we were discussing dinner plans rather than murder. Your parents really went all out. But the insurance payout will more than cover it. with plenty left over for my next courtship. You're next. You're already planning the next one? I have to keep busy somehow. Grief is only interesting for so long. He finished his champagne and set the glass aside. I've actually had my eye on a lovely kindergarten teacher named Julie. Sweet, trusting, recently lost her father, so she's vulnerable. Perfect target. The casual way he discussed destroying another woman's life made my stomach turn. But it also gave me an idea. David, I said, moving slowly toward the phone on the nightstand, have you considered that maybe someone might catch on to the pattern? For wives dying of sudden cardiac arrest. 3, he corrected. You'd be the 4th. And no, I'm not worried. I'm very careful about spacing them out, choosing different locations, varying the circumstances. Catherine died in Boston, Susan in Denver, Rebecca in Seattle. Your death here in Miami will look completely unrelated. He was proud of his planning, his attention to detail. He wanted to share his cleverness with someone who could appreciate it. How did you choose them? I asked, keeping him talking while I edged closer to the phone. Insurance policies, mostly. Has to be substantial enough to make the investment worthwhile. Catherine was worth $800,000, Susan $1 million, Rebecca $1.5 million. You're actually the smallest policy I've bothered with lately. But you were so eager to please, so grateful for my attention. His words stung because they were true. I had been eager to please him, grateful that someone like David Sterling, successful businessman, community leader, charming and handsome, had chosen me. I'd ignored red flags because I'd been so flattered by his interest. What red flags? I'd asked myself after each small warning sign. When he'd pressured me to take out the life insurance policy. When he'd insisted on a destination wedding far from my family and friends. When he'd been strangely uninterested in meeting my relatives or building relationships with people in my life. I'd explained it all away because I'd wanted so desperately to believe in our fairy tale romance. The poison, I said, still moving incrementally toward the phone. What did you use? Cyanide, derived from bitter almonds. Fast-acting, but it mimics heart attack symptoms if you don't know what to look for. Most small-town coroners wouldn't think to test for it, especially when the grieving widower is so helpful and cooperative. And if they did test? They won't. But if they did, well. He smiled that cold smile again. I've developed relationships with people in useful positions over the years. Amazing how many friends you can make when you're a wealthy, charming widower who donates generously to the right causes. Corruption, bribery, murder. How many people were complicit in his crimes? David, I said, finally reaching the phone. I think you should know something. What's that, darling? I never drank the champagne. His expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion to alarm as he processed what that meant. If I hadn't consumed the poison, if I was still healthy and alert, if I could call for help. He lunged across the room toward me. But I was already grabbing the phone and hitting 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Emma Carter at the Ritz-Carlton Key Biscayne, room 1247. My husband just tried to poison me. He's confessed to murdering 3 previous wives. I need police and paramedics immediately. David reached me as I was speaking and tried to grab the phone, but I held on and continued talking. The suspect is David Sterling. He's armed and dangerous. He's admitted to killing Catherine, Susan, and Rebecca. He struck me across the face, hard enough to knock me backward, but I didn't let go of the phone. He's attacking me now, please hurry. David grabbed my wrist and twisted until I dropped the phone, but the call was still connected. The 911 operator would have heard everything. You stupid bitch, he snarled, his mask completely gone now. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've stopped you from killing me. And hopefully from killing Julie, the kindergarten teacher you mentioned. His eyes widened. He'd forgotten he'd revealed his next target. They'll never prove anything, he said, but there was panic in his voice now. It's your word against mine, and you're clearly having some kind of psychotic break. Wedding stress, perhaps. Very sad. Actually, I said, rubbing my wrist where he'd twisted it, it's not just my word. It's also yours. The entire conversation has been recorded. I gestured toward the hotel room's security system, which included audio recording capabilities that guests could activate for their own protection. I triggered it the moment I'd realized what David was planning. The color drained from his face as he understood the implications. His confession, his details about previous murders, his plans for future victims, all of it captured on the hotel's security system. Sirens were already audible in the distance, growing closer. "You can't." He started, then stopped. There was nothing he could say. Nothing he could do. His perfect system had been destroyed by one intended victim who'd refused to play her part. The police arrived within minutes, followed closely by paramedics and FBI agents. While they searched the room and collected evidence, I sat on the bed I died in just hours ago in another timeline, watching David Sterling, serial killer, master manipulator, collector of dead wives, get handcuffed and read his rights. "Mrs. Sterling," one of the FBI agents said to me, "we're going to need a full statement about everything that happened here tonight." "Actually," I said, pulling off my wedding ring and dropping it on the nightstand next to the untouched champagne, "it's Miss Carter. I was never really married to him." The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of David's crimes. The FBI found evidence linking him to not just the 3 wives he confessed to killing, but 2 additional women whose deaths had been ruled natural but whose circumstances matched his pattern. Catherine Morrison died age 29 in Boston. Heart attack during her honeymoon. Susan Patterson died age 31 in Denver. Cardiac arrest on her wedding night. Rebecca Thompson died age 28 in Seattle. Heart failure during her honeymoon. Maria Rodriguez died age 30 in Phoenix. Heart attack 3 days after her wedding. Jennifer Walsh died age 32 in Portland. Cardiac arrest during her honeymoon week. 5 women, all young and healthy, all with substantial life insurance policies, all married to David Sterling under different aliases. The FBI estimated he'd collected over $6 million in insurance payouts over 7 years. But the most chilling discovery came when they searched his storage units and found trophies from each murder. Wedding photos, jewelry, personal items he'd kept as souvenirs. He'd been collecting mementos of his victims like a serial killer, taking pleasure not just in the money but in the act of destroying lives. "Miss Carter," Detective Rodriguez told me during one of my interviews, "I have to ask, how did you know? What made you realize what he was planning?" I couldn't tell them the truth about dying and coming back. Instead I said, something felt wrong about the champagne toast. The way he was watching me, the inconsistencies in his stories about his family. I've always been intuitive about people. It wasn't entirely a lie. In my previous life, I had felt something was wrong in those final moments, but I'd ignored my instincts because I trusted David more than myself. The trial was a media sensation. David Sterling, the charming businessman who'd murdered 5 wives for insurance money, became the subject of documentaries, true crime podcasts, and endless news coverage. During testimony, more details emerged about his methodology. He'd spent months researching each victim before approaching them. He looked for women who were financially stable enough to afford large insurance policies, but emotionally vulnerable enough to be easily manipulated. Recent deaths in the family, difficult divorces, job losses. Any trauma that made a woman crave stability and love. He'd create elaborate backstories for himself, complete with fake references and manufactured histories. His charm was so convincing that even trained investigators had initially believed his stories about being a grieving widower. He would study each victim for weeks before making contact, the prosecutor explained to the jury. He knew their routines, their friends, their vulnerabilities. He presented himself as exactly what each woman was looking for. For Catherine, he'd been a fellow artist who understood her creative soul. For Susan, he'd been a financial advisor who could provide the security she craved after her father's bankruptcy. For Rebecca, he'd been a fellow book lover who shared her passion for literature. For Maria, he'd been a devoted son caring for his elderly mother, appealing to her nurturing nature. For Jennifer, he'd been a fellow hiker and outdoorsman who shared her love of adventure. And for me, he'd been a successful businessman who appreciated my intelligence and independence, while making me feel cherished and protected. He'd tailored his entire persona to what each woman wanted most in a partner. David Sterling is not just a murderer, the prosecutor continued. He's a chameleon, a predator who studied his victims so thoroughly that he could become their perfect match. He didn't just kill these women. He violated their ability to trust their own judgment, their own hearts. David was convicted on all 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even more satisfying than his conviction was the testimony of Julie Morrison, the kindergarten teacher he'd mentioned as his next target. "He approached me 3 weeks ago," she told the court via video link. "He was charming, sweet, everything I thought I wanted in a man. He knew I'd recently lost my father, and he seemed to understand grief in a way that felt genuine. If Miss Carter hadn't exposed him, I have no doubt I would have been victim number 6. After the trial, I received letters from dozens of women who'd had brief relationships with David over the years, women who'd felt something was off about him but couldn't articulate what. Women who'd trusted their instincts and ended relationships that felt too good to be true. Their stories reinforced something I'd learned through dying and coming back. Women's intuition is almost always right. We talk ourselves out of trusting it because we're taught to be polite, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to believe that love conquers all. But sometimes love is just a mask that predators wear to get close enough to destroy you. I never remarried. The experience with David taught me to value my independence, to trust my instincts, to never again ignore warning signs for the sake of romance. I used my share of the recovered insurance money to start a foundation that helps women escape dangerous relationships and provides training to help people recognize manipulation tactics. 5 years later, I still live in the same city where David and I met, but I've built a completely different life. I work with domestic violence counselors, teach self-defense classes, and speak at conferences about recognizing predatory behavior in relationships. Sometimes people ask me how I knew to be suspicious of the champagne toast, how I recognized David's true nature when so many other intelligent women had fallen for his act. The truth is complicated. In some ways, I was lucky. I'd been given advance warning through an experience I couldn't explain or prove, but in other ways, the warning signs had always been there. I'd just chosen to ignore them because I'd wanted so desperately to believe in our love story. The most important lesson I learned is this: when something feels wrong, it usually is. When someone seems too good to be true, they probably are. And when your instincts tell you to run, you should listen. Even if you can't explain why. Especially if you can't explain why. David Sterling taught me that predators are often the most charming people in the room. They're masters of manipulation, experts at telling women exactly what they want to hear. They study their victims so thoroughly that they can become the perfect partner, until the moment they decide you're worth more dead than alive. But they can't simulate genuine emotion. They can't fake the small, unconscious gestures that reveal true care. And they can't maintain their masks indefinitely, especially when their plans are threatened. On my wedding night, I died learning these lessons. But somehow, impossibly, I was given a second chance to use that knowledge. Not everyone gets a chance to come back from the dead. But everyone can learn to trust their instincts, to value their own judgment, to believe that they deserve better than someone who sees them as a target rather than a person. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who claims to love you most. And sometimes the only way to survive is to trust yourself more than you trust their beautiful lies. But the story doesn't end with David's conviction. In fact, that was just the beginning of uncovering a network of predators that stretched far beyond one man's twisted desires. 3 months after the trial, I received a call from Detective Rodriguez that changed everything I thought I knew about David's crimes. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice tense with excitement and dread, "we need you to come to the station. We've discovered something about your case that you need to hear." I drove to the police station with a growing sense of unease. David was already in prison for life. What could they have possibly discovered that required my immediate attention? Detective Rodriguez met me in the lobby, her expression grim. "Emma, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. We've been investigating David's financial records more thoroughly, and we've discovered that he wasn't working alone." She led me to a conference room where several FBI agents were waiting, along with boxes of evidence and a wall covered with photos and documents connected by red string, the kind of investigation board you see in crime movies. "Agent Harrison will explain," Detective Rodriguez said, gesturing to a tall woman with gray hair and sharp eyes. "Miss Carter," Agent Harrison began, "we've uncovered evidence that David Sterling was part of a larger organization, what we're calling a murder syndicate, that specializes in targeting wealthy women for insurance fraud." I felt the blood drain from my face. "A syndicate?" At least 12 men operating across 15 states, using similar methods to what David employed with you and his other victims. They've been doing this for over a decade. Agent Harrison pointed to the wall of evidence. They have a sophisticated system. They share information about potential targets, provide each other with fake references and backstories, and even have contacts within insurance companies and coroners' offices to help cover their tracks. The scope of what she was describing was overwhelming. David hadn't been a lone wolf predator. He'd been part of an organized criminal enterprise that treated women's lives like commodities to be harvested. How many victims? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. We've identified 47 confirmed deaths so far, but we believe there may be more. These men are careful, patient, and they've been refining their methods for years. 47 women. 47 lives cut short by men who saw them as nothing more than financial opportunities. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because we need your help, Agent Harrison said. David's arrest has spooked the network. They're communicating more frequently, making mistakes. We have a chance to take down the entire operation, but we need someone with inside knowledge of their methods. What kind of help? We want you to go undercover. The request hit me like a physical blow. They wanted me to put myself back in danger, to pretend to be vulnerable to these predators, to risk my life to catch killers. I know it's a lot to ask, Detective Rodriguez said quickly. But think about it. You're the only surviving victim we know of. You understand their psychology, their methods. You could help us save dozens of other women. I thought about Julie Morrison, the kindergarten teacher who would have been David's next victim. I thought about the 47 women who hadn't been as lucky as me, who hadn't gotten a second chance to recognize the danger they were in. What would I have to do? Agent Harrison spread out a series of documents on the table. We've identified their next likely target, a woman named Victoria Chun in San Francisco. She's a successful architect, recently divorced, with a substantial life insurance policy. 3 different men from the network have already made contact with her through dating apps. They coordinate their approaches. They share intelligence. They know her favorite restaurants, her hobbies, her emotional vulnerabilities. One of them will eventually be chosen to make the serious approach, while the others will fade into the background. And you want me to do what exactly? We want you to befriend Victoria, gain her trust, and help us gather evidence when one of these men makes his move. You'd be wearing recording equipment, of course, and we'd have agents watching you at all times. The plan was dangerous, complicated, and absolutely necessary. If this network continued operating, how many more women would die? I'll do it, I said. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to San Francisco with a new identity and a detailed backstory. According to my cover, I was Sarah Mitchell, a freelance graphic designer who'd recently moved to the city after a difficult breakup. I'd met Victoria Chun through a pottery class, a meeting that had actually been carefully orchestrated by the FBI. Victoria was everything the profile had described: intelligent, successful, and vulnerable in the wake of her divorce. She was also kind, funny, and genuinely searching for meaningful connection. Getting to know her while knowing she was being hunted by multiple predators was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. I'm trying to get back out there, she told me over coffee one afternoon. But dating feels so different now. Everyone's on apps, and it's hard to know who's genuine. If only she knew how right she was. The FBI had identified the 3 men targeting her. Marcus Webb, who'd approached her as a fellow architect interested in sustainable design. Jonathan Mills, who'd presented himself as a wine enthusiast and gourmet cook. Thomas Reed, who'd claimed to be a widowed father looking for a serious relationship. All 3 had been messaging Victoria for weeks, slowly building relationships and gathering information about her life, her finances, and her vulnerabilities. Which one do you like best? I asked, though the question made my stomach turn. I don't know, Victoria said, scrolling through her dating app. Marcus seems really passionate about his work, and we have so much in common professionally. Jonathan is romantic and charming. He keeps sending me pictures of these elaborate meals he's cooking. And Thomas, there's something so genuine about him. He talks about his late wife with such love, and he's clearly devoted to his daughter. Every word she said felt like a knife twist. She was falling for their carefully constructed personas, just as I had fallen for David's lies. Over the next month, I watched as each man escalated his courtship. Marcus invited Victoria to gallery openings and architectural tours. Jonathan planned elaborate dinner dates and sent expensive wine to her office. Thomas shared heart-wrenching stories about single parenthood and slowly introduced the idea of meeting his daughter, who I knew from FBI surveillance was actually a child actor hired for the role. "I think I'm falling for Thomas," Victoria confided in me 6 weeks into my undercover assignment. "There's something so authentic about him. He's not trying to impress me with money or grand gestures. He just seems like a genuinely good man." That was exactly what made him so dangerous. The FBI had determined that Thomas Reed was the most skilled manipulator in the network, responsible for at least 8 confirmed kills. He specialized in targeting divorced women with children, presenting himself as the perfect stepfather figure. "Victoria," I said carefully, "can I ask you something? Have any of these men asked about your insurance policies or financial situation?" She looked surprised by the question. "Well, Thomas mentioned that he'd increased his life insurance after his wife died, to make sure his daughter would be taken care of. He suggested I might want to do the same, especially if I'm thinking about starting a new family." There it was, the same suggestion David had made to me about increasing my life insurance policy. "Has he offered to help you with that? Maybe recommended an insurance agent?" "Actually, yes. He knows someone who specializes in policies for high-net-worth individuals." "Why?" "Because that insurance agent was probably part of the network, someone who would ensure that Thomas was named as the beneficiary and that the policy would pay out quickly after my death." "Just curious," I said. "It seems like a strange topic for early in a relationship." That evening, I met with Agent Harrison to report on the conversation. "He's moving faster than we expected," she said. "The insurance discussion usually doesn't happen until they're engaged or married. Maybe he's feeling pressure because Victoria's talking to multiple men. He needs to secure her before one of the others makes a move. We need to accelerate our timeline. We're going to have Thomas arrested when he meets with the insurance agent, but we need evidence of his intent to commit murder." "How do we get that?" "You're going to tell Victoria you're concerned about Thomas's motives. When she confronts him, he'll either back off, which means we lose our chance, or he'll reveal his true nature." It was a risky strategy, but it was our best option for gathering the evidence needed to dismantle the entire network. The next day, I approached Victoria with carefully rehearsed concerns about Thomas's behavior. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," I said, "and something feels off about Thomas pushing the insurance discussion so early." Victoria's expression immediately became defensive. "What do you mean?" I looked him up online, and I couldn't find much information about his late wife or his daughter. No obituary, no social media presence, no school records. This was partially true. The FBI had been unable to verify any of Thomas's backstory because it was entirely fabricated. "Maybe he's just private about his personal life," Victoria said, but I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. "Maybe, but combined with the insurance pressure. Victoria, I'm worried about you." That evening, Victoria confronted Thomas about the inconsistencies in his story. The FBI had placed recording equipment in her apartment, so we captured the entire conversation. At first, Thomas maintained his innocent facade, explaining away the missing online presence as a desire for privacy after his wife's death. But when Victoria pressed harder, when she mentioned that I'd been asking questions, his mask began to slip. "Your friend Sarah is jealous," he said, his voice taking on an edge I recognized from my confrontation with David. "She's trying to sabotage our relationship because she can't stand to see you happy. She's just looking out for me." "Is she? Or is she one of those women who can't bear to see their friends in successful relationships?" The conversation continued for over an hour, with Thomas alternating between manipulation tactics, gaslighting Victoria's concerns, isolating her from support systems, and gradually revealing his true controlling nature. The breakthrough came when Victoria mentioned that she'd spoken to her ex-husband about the insurance policy Thomas had recommended. "You told Robert about our private conversation?" Thomas's voice became cold, dangerous. "That was supposed to be between us. I tell Robert about important financial decisions. We have joint custody of Emma, and these things affect her future." "Emma?" Thomas's confusion was evident. In all his research on Victoria, he'd somehow missed that she had a daughter from her previous marriage. My daughter Emma. I've mentioned her before. There was a long pause. Then Thomas's voice, completely different now. No, you haven't. Victoria realized her mistake immediately. She had mentioned her daughter before, to Marcus and Jonathan, but not to Thomas. She'd been juggling multiple conversations and mixed up which man she'd told what information to. I'm sorry, I thought I had. You're lying to me, Thomas said, and his voice was pure ice. Just like you lied about being serious about this relationship. You're playing games, talking to multiple men, treating this like some kind of entertainment. The recording captured the sound of furniture moving, Victoria's sharp intake of breath, the change in Thomas's breathing that suggested physical intimidation. Thomas, you're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. Do you have any idea what I've invested in this relationship? The time, the money, the effort? And you're treating it like a joke. I think you should leave. I'm not going anywhere until we finish this conversation. That's when the FBI moved in. The arrest of Thomas Reed led to a cascade of additional arrests, as the Bureau used his phone and computer records to identify other members of the network. Within 6 months, they'd rounded up the entire syndicate, 15 men who'd been responsible for at least 63 murders over 12 years. The investigation revealed the full scope of their operation. They had contacts within insurance companies who fast-tracked policy approvals and payouts. They had corrupt coroners who misclassified murders as natural deaths or accidents. They even had a network of actors and accomplices who played roles in their elaborate deceptions. Fake family members, fake friends, fake colleagues who could provide character references. Most chilling of all, they had detailed profiles on hundreds of potential victims. Women they'd been researching and stalking, waiting for the right moment to make their approach. Victoria was devastated when she learned the truth about Thomas, Marcus, and Jonathan. All 3 men had been planning to murder her, and she'd been choosing between them like they were legitimate romantic options. How could I be so stupid? She asked me during one of our debriefings. I pride myself on being intelligent, on being able to read people. How did I miss all the warning signs? Because they're professionals, I told her. They've spent years perfecting their techniques. They study psychology, they research their victims thoroughly, and they present themselves as exactly what each woman is looking for. But you figured it out. You survived. I got lucky. And I had advance warning that something was wrong. I couldn't tell her about dying and being reborn, but I could share the broader truth. The important thing is that we stopped them. No other women will die because of these men. The trial of the murder syndicate made national headlines. The prosecution presented evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated like a corporation, with specialized roles and systematic methods for identifying, targeting, and killing victims. The defense attorneys tried to argue that their clients were simply unlucky in love, that the deaths of their wives had been tragic coincidences. But the evidence was overwhelming: the shared communication networks, the coordinated research on victims, the financial benefits that each man had received from their wives' deaths. All 15 men were convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. Most received life sentences without the possibility of parole. But the most satisfying moment of the trial came when I was called to testify about David's confession on our wedding night. Mr. Sterling told you he was planning to kill a kindergarten teacher named Julie? The prosecutor asked. Yes. He said he'd already selected his next victim. And what happened to Julie Morrison after Mr. Sterling's arrest? She's alive and well. She's now a victim's advocate who helps other women recognize predatory behavior in relationships. The courtroom was silent as I continued my testimony, describing not just David's crimes but the broader network of killers he'd been part of. These men didn't just murder women, I said, looking directly at the jury. They murdered women's ability to trust their own judgment. They exploited our capacity for love, our desire for connection, our hope for happiness. They turned our greatest strengths into vulnerabilities. After the trials concluded, I received hundreds of letters from women who'd recognized their own experiences in my testimony. Women who'd dated men who'd pushed for quick engagements, who'd insisted on large insurance policies, who'd isolated them from friends and family. Many of them had trusted their instincts and ended relationships that felt wrong, even when they couldn't articulate why. Others had ignored warning signs and found themselves in dangerous situations they'd barely escaped. "Your story saved my life," one woman wrote. "I was 6 weeks away from marrying a man who'd been pressuring me to increase my life insurance. After hearing your testimony, I hired a private investigator. Turns out he was already married to 2 other women and had a history of suspicious deaths in his past." Another letter came from a woman in Texas. "My fiancé kept asking about my family's financial situation and suggesting I update my will. When I saw the news coverage of your case, I recognized the pattern. I called off the wedding and went to the police. They're now investigating 3 other women who died after dating him." The foundation I'd started after David's conviction expanded significantly after the syndicate trials. We developed educational programs to help women recognize manipulation tactics, establish support networks for survivors of predatory relationships, and worked with law enforcement to identify potential serial killers who targeted romantic partners. 5 years after my wedding night death and resurrection, I stood before a congressional committee that was considering new legislation to regulate the insurance industry and improve coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating suspicious deaths. "Representatives," I said, "the murder syndicate that targeted me and 62 other women was able to operate for over a decade because our systems aren't designed to recognize patterns of domestic violence that cross state lines. These men didn't look like criminals. They looked like successful, charming partners who happened to have bad luck with wives who died young." I testified about the need for better communication between insurance companies, coroners' offices, and police departments, about the importance of training law enforcement to recognize signs of systematic predatory behavior, about the necessity of supporting women's instincts when they sense something is wrong in their relationships. The most dangerous person in a woman's life is often the one who claims to love her most, I concluded. We need systems that acknowledge this reality and protect women accordingly. The legislation passed 6 months later, establishing new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths in domestic relationships and creating a national database to track patterns of behavior across jurisdictions. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of my experience came 3 years later, when I received an invitation to speak at a high school graduation ceremony. The valedictorian was a young woman named Emma Martinez, the daughter of Maria Rodriguez, one of David's earlier victims. Maria had died when Emma was 15, leaving her to be raised by her grandmother. "Miss Carter," Emma said when we met before the ceremony, "my grandmother told me that you helped catch the man who killed my mother. I wanted to thank you." "Your mother deserved justice," I said. "I'm sorry it took so long. Actually, I wanted to tell you something. Your story, what you shared about trusting your instincts and recognizing manipulation, it helped me in my own life. I had a boyfriend who was exhibiting some of the warning signs you described. He was pressuring me to make financial decisions, isolating me from my friends, making me doubt my own judgment. What did you do?" I remembered what you said about trusting women's intuition. I ended the relationship, even though I couldn't fully explain why something felt wrong. Later, I found out he'd done similar things to other girls at school. Emma was planning to study criminal justice in college, with the goal of becoming a detective specializing in domestic violence cases. I want to protect other women the way someone should have protected my mother. As I watched her give her valedictorian speech about the importance of standing up for others and trusting your inner voice, I realized that my death and resurrection on that wedding night had created ripples that extended far beyond my own survival. Every woman who'd recognized warning signs because of my story. Every life that had been saved because the murder syndicate was exposed. Every future victim who would be protected because of the legislation that passed. Every young woman like Emma who would choose careers in law enforcement or victim advocacy because they'd learned that women's lives matter. That night, I returned to my hotel room and opened my laptop to work on the memoir I'd been writing about my experience. The working title was Dead Wrong: How I Came Back from My Wedding Night Murder to Expose a Network of Killers. But as I sat there thinking about Emma Martinez and all the other women whose lives had been changed by the exposure of David's network, I realized the real story wasn't just about my death and resurrection. It was about the community of women who'd come together to protect each other from predators who saw us as prey. The book, when it was finally published, became a bestseller and led to speaking engagements around the world. But more importantly, It sparked conversations in communities everywhere about how to recognize and respond to predatory behavior in relationships. 10 years after my wedding night, I was invited back to the Ritz-Carlton in Key Biscayne for a documentary about the murder syndicate case. The hotel had been renovated since then, but they'd preserved room 1247 as part of their corporate training program on recognizing signs of domestic violence. Standing in that room again, looking at the bed where I'd died and been reborn, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for the second chance I'd been given, sorrow for the women who hadn't been as fortunate, pride in the justice that had been served, and determination to continue the work of protecting other women from predators who hide behind masks of love. The documentary crew asked me to recreate my final conversation with David, but I declined. Some moments are too sacred, too transformative to be turned into entertainment. Instead, I stood on the balcony where I'd looked out at the ocean in my final moments of that previous life, and spoke directly to the camera about the importance of trusting women's instincts. Every woman watching this has felt that moment when something doesn't feel right in a relationship, I said. That moment when your partner's story doesn't quite add up, when they're pushing too hard for commitment, when they're isolating you from people who care about you. That feeling in your gut that tells you something is wrong, trust it. Don't let anyone convince you that you're being paranoid or unreasonable. Don't sacrifice your safety for the sake of being polite. Don't ignore warning signs because you want to believe in love. The most dangerous person in your life might be the one who seems too good to be true. And sometimes the only way to survive is to trust yourself more than you trust their beautiful lies. The documentary aired on the 10-year anniversary of my wedding night death, and within hours, the domestic violence hotlines were flooded with calls from women who'd recognized their own situations in my story. That night, I received a text message from Julie Morrison, the kindergarten teacher who would have been David's next victim. Watch the documentary. Thank you for saving my life, and for continuing to save others. I looked out my window at the city lights, thinking about all the women who were going to sleep tonight in safety because a network of killers had been exposed and stopped. Women who would wake up tomorrow with the knowledge that their instincts could be trusted, that their lives had value, that someone was watching out for them. The champagne glass from my wedding night is still in evidence storage somewhere, a crystal reminder of how close I came to becoming just another statistic. But more importantly, it's evidence of how one woman's refusal to drink the poison led to justice for 63 others. Some toasts are meant to celebrate new beginnings. Others are meant to be your last. The difference is knowing which is which, and having the courage to trust your judgment when everything in your heart wants to believe in love. Sometimes the most important word a woman can learn to say is no. No to the drink. No to the pressure. No to the lies disguised as romance. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, saying no can save not just your own life, but the lives of every woman who comes after you. That's a toast worth making, with clear eyes, a clear head, and a clear understanding that your life is worth more than anyone else's profit. The glass may still be full of poison, but I'm alive to warn others not to drink. And that makes all the difference.